the 9th book, entitled Calliope. Mardonius, when Alexander upon his return made known to him the answer of the Athenians, forthwith broke up from Thessaly and led his army with all speed against Athens, forcing the several nations through whose land he passed to furnish him with additional troops. The chief men of Thessaly, far from repenting of the part which they had taken in the war hitherto, urged on the Persians to the attack more earnestly than ever. Thorax of Larissa in particular, who had helped to escort Xerxes on his flight to Asia, now openly encouraged Mardonius in his march upon Greece. When the army reached Boeotia, the Thebans sought to induce Mardonius to make a halt. He would not, they told him, find anywhere a more convenient place in which to pitch his camp, and their advice to him was that he should go no further, but fix himself there, and thence take measures to subdue all Greece without striking a blow. If the Greeks, who had held together hitherto, still continued united among themselves, it would be difficult for the whole world to overcome them by force of arms. But if thou wilt do as we advise, they went on to say, thou mayst easily obtain the direction of all their counsels. Send presents to the men of most weight in the several states, and by so doing thou wilt sow division among them. After that it will be a light task, with the help of such as side with thee, to bring under all thy adversaries. Such was the advice of the Thebans, but Mardonius didn't follow it. A strong desire of taking Athens a second time possessed him, in part arising from his inborn stubbornness, in part from a wish to inform the king at Sardis by fire signals along the islands that he was master of the place. However, he didn't on his arrival in Attica find the Athenians in their country. They had again withdrawn, some to their ships, but the greater part to Salamis, and he only gained possession of a deserted town. It was 10 months after the taking of the city by the king that Mardonius came against it for the second time. Mardonius, being now in Athens, sent an envoy to Salamis, one Eurycodes, a Hellespontine Greek, to offer the Athenians once more the same terms which had been conveyed to them by Alexander. The reason for his sending a second time, though he knew beforehand their unfriendly feelings towards him, was that he hoped, when they saw the whole land of Attica conquered and in his power, their stubbornness would begin to give way. On this account, therefore, he dispatched Eurycodes to Salamis. Now when Eurycodes came before the council and delivered his message, one of the councillors, named Lycidas, gave it as his opinion that the best course would be to admit the proposals brought by Eurycodes and lay them before the assembly of the people. This he stated to be his opinion, perhaps because he had been bribed by Mardonius, or it may be because that course really appeared to him the most expedient. However, the Athenians, both those in the council and those who stood without, when they heard of the advice, were full of wrath, and forthwith surrounded Lycidas and stoned him to death. As for Eurycodes, the Hellespontine Greek, him they sent away unharmed. Now there was a stir in the island about Lycidas, and the Athenian women learnt what had happened. Then each exhorted her fellow, and one brought another to take part in the deed, and they all flocked of their own accord to the house of Lycidas, and stoned to death his wife and his children. The circumstances under which the Athenians had sought refuge in Salamis were the following. So long as any hope remained that a Peloponnesian army should come to give them aid, they abode still in Attica. But when it appeared that the allies were slack and slow to move, while the invader was reported to be pressing forward and to have already entered Boeotia, then they proceeded to remove their goods and chattels from the mainland, and to themselves again crossed the strait to Salamis. At the same time they sent ambassadors to Lacedaemon, who were to reproach the Lacedaemonians for having allowed the barbarian to advance into Attica, instead of joining them and going out to meet him in Boeotia. They were likewise to remind the Lacedaemonians of the offers by which the Persian had sought to win Athens over to his side, and to warn them that if no aid came from Sparta, the Athenians must consult for their own safety. The truth was, the Lacedaemonians were keeping holiday at that time, for it was the feast of the Hyrcanthia, and they thought nothing of so much moment as to perform the service of the god. They were also engaged in building their wall across the isthmus, which was now so far advanced that the battlements had begun to be placed upon it. When the envoys of the Athenians, accompanied by ambassadors from Megara and Plataea, reached Lacedaemon, they came before the ephors and spoke as follows. The Athenians have sent us to you to say the king of the Medes offers to give us back our country, and wishes to conclude an alliance with us on fair and equal terms without fraud or deceit. He is willing likewise to bestow on us another country besides our own, and bids us choose any land that we like. But we, because we reverenced Hellenic Zeus, and thought it a shameful act to betray Greece, instead of consenting to these terms, refused them, notwithstanding that we have been wronged and deserted by the other Greeks, and are fully aware that it's far more for our advantage to make peace with the Persian than to prolong the war with him. Still we shall not, of our own free will, consent to any terms of peace. Thus do we, in all our dealings with the Greeks, avoid what is base and counterfeit. While, contrariwise, ye who were but now so full of fear lest we should make terms with the enemy, having learnt of what temper we are, and assured yourselves that we shall not prove traitors to our country, having brought moreover your wall across the isthmus to an advanced state, cease altogether to have any care for us. Ye covenanted with us to go out and meet the Persian in Boeotia. But when the time came, ye were false to your word, and looked on while the barbarian host advanced into Attica. At this time, therefore, the Athenians are angered with you, and justly, for ye have not done what was right. They bid you, however, make haste to send forth your army, that we may even yet meet Mardonius in Attica. Now that Boeotia is lost to us, the best place for the fight within our country will be the plain of Thria. The ephors, when they had heard this speech, delayed their answer till the morrow, and when the morrow came, till the day following. And thus they acted for 10 days, continually putting off the ambassadors from one day to the next. Meanwhile the Peloponnesians generally were labouring with great zeal at the wall, and the work nearly approached completion. I can give no other reason for the conduct of the Lacedaemonians in showing themselves so anxious at the time when Alexander came that the Athenians should not join the Medes, and now being quite careless about it, except that at the former time the wall across the isthmus was not complete, and they worked at it in great fear of the Persians, whereas now the bulwark had been raised, and so they imagined that they had no further need of the Athenians. At last the ambassadors got an answer, and the troops marched forth from Sparta under the following circumstances. The last audience had been fixed for the ambassadors, when the very day before it was to be given, a certain Tegean named Cilius, a man who had more influence in Sparta than any other foreigner, learning from the ephors exactly what the Athenians had said, addressed these words to them. The case stands thus, O ye ephors. If the Athenians are not our friends, but league themselves with the barbarians, however strong our wall across the isthmus may be, there will be doors enough and wide enough open too, by which the Persian may gain entrance to the Peloponnese. Grant their request then, before they make any fresh resolve, and may bring Greece to ruin. Such was the counsel which Cilius gave, and the ephors, taking the advice into consideration, determined forthwith, without speaking a word to the ambassadors from the 3 cities, to dispatch to the isthmus a body of 5,000 Spartans. And accordingly they sent them forth the same night, appointing to each Spartan a retinue of 7 helots, and giving the command of the expedition to Pausanias, the son of Cleombrotus. The chief power belonged of right at this time to Pleistarchus, the son of Leonidas, but as he was still a child, Pausanias, his cousin, was regent in his room. For the father of Pausanias, Cleombrotus, the son of Anaxandridas, no longer lived. He'd died a short time after bringing back from the isthmus the troops who had been employed in building the wall. A prodigy had caused him to bring his army home, for while he was offering sacrifice to know if he should march out against the Persian, the sun was suddenly darkened in mid-sky. Pausanias took with him, as joint leader of the army, Euryanax, the son of Dorius, a member of his own family. The army accordingly had marched out from Sparta with Pausanias, while the ambassadors, when day came, appeared before the ephors, knowing nothing of the march of the troops, and purposing themselves to leave Sparta forthwith and return each man to his own country. They therefore addressed the ephors in these words: Lacedaemonians, as you do not stir from home, but keep the Hyacinthean festival, and amuse yourselves, deserting the cause of your confederates, the Athenians, whom your behaviour wrongs, and who have no other allies, will make terms with the Persians as they shall find possible. Now when terms are once made, it's plain that having become the king's allies, we shall march with the barbarians whithersoever they choose to lead. Then at length you will perceive what the consequences will be to yourselves. When the envoys had spoken, the ephors declared to them with an oath, Our troops must be at Orestium by this time, on their march against the strangers. The Spartans say strangers for barbarians. At this the ambassadors, quite ignorant of what had happened, questioned them concerning their meaning, and when by much questioning they had discovered the truth, they were greatly astonished thereat, and forthwith set off at their best speed to overtake the Spartan army. At the same time a body of 5,000 Lacedaemonian perioikoi, all picked men and fully armed, set forth from Sparta in the company of the ambassadors. So these troops marched in haste towards the isthmus. Meanwhile the Argives, who had promised Mardonius that they would stop the Spartans from crossing their borders, as soon as they learnt that Pausanias with his army had started from Sparta, took the swiftest courier they could find and sent him off to Attica. The message which he delivered on his arrival at Athens was the following: Mardonius, he said, the Argives have sent me to tell thee that the Lacedaemonian youth are gone forth from their city, and that the Argives are too weak to hinder them. Take good heed, therefore, to thyself at this time. After thus speaking, without a word more, he returned home. When Mardonius learnt that the Spartans were on their march, he no longer cared to remain in Attica. Hitherto he had kept quiet, wishing to see what the Athenians would do, and had neither ravaged their territory nor done it any the least harm. For till now he had cherished the hope that the Athenians would come to terms with him. As, however, he found that his persuasions were of no avail, and as their whole policy was now clear to him, he determined to withdraw from Attica before Pausanias and his army reached the isthmus. First, however, he resolved to burn Athens, and to cast down and level with the ground whatever remained standing of the walls, temples, and other buildings. His reason for retreating was that Attica was not a country where horse could act with advantage, and further, that if he suffered defeat in a battle, no way of escape was open to him except through defiles, where a handful of troops might stop all his army. So he determined to withdraw to Thebes, and give the Greeks battle in the neighbourhood of a friendly city, and on ground well suited for cavalry. After he'd quitted Attica and was already upon his march, news reached him that a body of 1,000 Lacedaemonians, distinct from the army of Pausanias, and sent on in advance, had arrived in the Megarid. When he heard it, wishing if possible to destroy this detachment first, Mardonius considered with himself how he might compass their ruin. With the sudden change of march he made for Megara, while the horse, pushing on in advance, entered and ravaged the Megarid. Here was the furthest point in Europe towards the setting sun to which this Persian army ever penetrated. After this, Mardonius received another message, whereby he learned that the forces of the Greeks were collected together at the isthmus, which tidings caused him to draw back and leave Attica by the way of Decelea. The Boeotarchs had sent for some of the neighbours of the Asopians, and these persons served as guides to the army, and led them first to Spendale, and from thence to Tanagra, where Mardonius rested a night. after which, upon the morrow, he bent his course to Scolus, which brought him into the territory of the Thebans. And now, although the Thebans had espoused the cause of the Medes, yet Mardonius cut down all the trees in those parts, not, however, from any enmity towards the Thebans, but on account of his own urgent needs, for he wanted a rampart to protect his army from attack, and he likewise desired to have a place of refuge whither his troops might flee, in case the battle should go contrary to his wishes. His army at this time lay on the Asopus, and stretched from Erythrae along by Hysiae to the territory of the Plataeans. The wall, however, was not made to extend so far, but formed a square of about 10 furlongs each way. While the barbarians were employed in this work, a certain citizen of Thebes, Atagenas by name, the son of Phrynon, having made great preparations, gave a banquet, and invited Mardonius thereto, together with 50 of the noblest Persians. Now the banquet was held at Thebes, and all the guests who were invited came to it. What follows was recounted to me by Thersander, a native of Orchomenus, a man of the first rank in that city. Thersander told me that he was himself among those invited to the feast, and that besides the Persians 50 Thebans were asked, and the two nations were not arranged separately, but a Persian and a Theban were set side by side upon each couch. After the feast was ended and the drinking had begun, the Persian who shared Thersander's couch addressed him in the Greek tongue, and inquired of him from what city he came. He answered that he was of Orchomenus, whereupon the other said, "Since thou hast eaten with me at one table and poured libation from one cup, I would fain leave with thee a memorial of the belief I hold, the rather that thou mayest have timely warning thyself, and so be able to provide for thy own safety. Seest thou these Persians here feasting, and the army which we left encamped yonder by the river side? Yet a little while, and of all this number thou wilt behold but a few surviving." As he spake, the Persian let fall a flood of tears, whereon Thersander, who was astonished at his words, replied, "Surely thou shouldst say all this to Mardonius, and the Persians who are next him in honour." But the other rejoined, "Dear friend, it's not possible for man to avert that which God has decreed shall happen. No one believes warnings, however true. Many of us Persians know our danger, but we are constrained by necessity to do as our leader bids us. Verily, 'tis the sorest of all human ills to abound in knowledge, and yet have no power over action." All this I heard myself from Thersander the Orchomenian, who told me further that he mentioned what had happened to divers persons before the battle was fought at Plataea. When Mardonius formerly held his camp in Boeotia, all the Greeks of those parts who were friendly to the Medes sent troops to join his army, and these troops accompanied him in his attack upon Athens. The Phocians alone abstained and took no part in the invasion, for though they had espoused the Median cause warmly, it was very much against their will, and only because they were compelled so to do. However, a few days after the arrival of the Persian army at Thebes, 1,000 of their heavy-armed soldiers came up, under the command of Harmachides, one of their most distinguished citizens. No sooner had these troops reached Thebes than some horsemen came to them from Mardonius, with orders that they should take up a position upon the plain away from the rest of the army. The Phocians did so, and forthwith the entire Persian cavalry drew nigh to them, whereupon there went a rumour through the whole of the Greek force encamped with the Medes that Mardonius was about to destroy the Phocians with missiles. The same conviction ran through the Phocian troops themselves, and Harmachides, their leader, addressed them thus with words of encouragement. "Phocians," said he, "'tis plain that these men have resolved beforehand to take our lives because of the accusations of the Thessalians, as I imagine. Now then is the time for you all to show yourselves brave men. 'Tis better to die fighting and defending our lives than tamely to allow them to slay us in this shameful fashion. Let them learn that they are barbarians, and that the men whose death they have plotted are Greeks." Thus spake Harmachides, and the Persian horse, having encircled the Phocians, charged towards them as if about to deal out death, with bows bent and arrows ready to be let fly. Nay, here and there some did even discharge their weapons, but the Phocians stood firm, keeping close one to another, and serrying their ranks as much as possible, whereupon the horse suddenly wheeled round and rode off. I can't say with certainty whether they came at the prayer of the Thessalians to destroy the Phocians, but seeing them prepared to stand on their defence, and fearing to suffer damage at their hands, on that account beat a retreat, having orders from Mardonius so to act, or whether his sole intent was to try the temper of the Phocians, and see whether they had any courage or no. However this may have been, when the horsemen retired, Mardonius sent a herald to the Phocians, saying, "Fear not, Phocians, ye have shown yourselves valiant men, much unlike the report I had heard of you. Now therefore be forward in the coming war. Ye will not readily outdo either the king or myself in services." Thus ended the affair of the Phocians. The Lacedaemonians, when they reached the isthmus, pitched their camp there, and the other Peloponnesians, who had embraced the good side, hearing or else seeing that they were upon the march, thought it not right to remain behind when the Spartans were going forth to the war. So the Peloponnesians went out in one body from the isthmus, the victims being favourable for setting forth, and marched as far as Eleusis, where again they offered sacrifices, and finding the omens still encouraging, advanced further. At Eleusis they were joined by the Athenians, who had come across from Salamis, and now accompanied the main army. On reaching Erythrae in Boeotia, they learnt that the barbarians were encamped upon the Asopus, wherefore they themselves, after considering how they should act, disposed their forces opposite to the enemy upon the slopes of Mount Cithaeron. Mardonius, when he saw that the Greeks would not come down into the plain, sent all his cavalry under Mecistius, or Macistius, as the Greeks call him, to attack them where they were. Now Mecistius was a man of much repute among the Persians, and rode a Nisaean charger with a golden bit, and otherwise magnificently caparisoned. So the horse advanced against the Greeks, and made attacks upon them in divisions, doing them great damage at each charge, and insulting them by calling them women. It chanced that the Megarians were drawn up in the position most open to attack, and where the ground offered the best approach to the cavalry. Finding themselves therefore hard pressed by the assaults upon their ranks, they sent a herald to the Greek leaders, who came and said to them, "This is the message of the Megarians. We cannot, brothers in arms, continue to resist the Persian horse in that post which we have occupied from the first, if we are left without succours. Hitherto, although hard-pressed, we have held out against them firmly and courageously. Now, however, if you do not send others to take our place, we warn you that we shall quit our post." Such were the words of the herald. Pausanias, when he heard of them, inquired among his troops if there were any who would volunteer to take the post, and so relieve the Megarians. Of the rest, none were willing to go, whereupon the Athenians offered themselves, and a body of picked men, 300 in number, commanded by Olympiodorus, the son of Lampo, undertook the service. Selecting to accompany them the whole body of archers, these men relieved the Megarians, and occupied a post which all the other Greeks collected at Erythrae had shrunk from holding. After the struggle had continued for a while, it came to an end on this wise. As the barbarians continued charging in divisions, the horse of Mecistius, which was in front of the others, received an arrow in his flank, the pain of which caused him to rear and throw his rider. Immediately the Athenians rushed upon Mecistius as he lay, caught his horse, and when he himself made resistance, slew him. At first, however, they weren't able to take his life, for his armour hindered them. He had on a breastplate formed of golden scales, with a scarlet tunic covering it. Thus the blows, all falling upon his breastplate, took no effect, till one of the soldiers, perceiving the reason, drove his weapon into his eye, and so slew him. All this took place without any of the other horsemen seeing it. They had neither observed their leader fall from his horse, nor beheld him slain, for he fell as they wheeled around and prepared for another charge, so that they were quite ignorant of what had happened. When, however, they halted and found that there was no one to marshal their line, Mecistius was missed, and instantly his soldiers, understanding what must have fallen him, with loud cheers charged the enemy in one mass, hoping to recover the dead body. So when the Athenians saw that instead of coming up in squadrons, the whole mass of the horse was about to charge them at once, they called out to the other troops to make haste to their aid. While the rest of the infantry, however, was moving to their assistance, the contest waxed fierce about the dead body of Mecistius. The 300, so long as they fought by themselves, had greatly the worse of the encounter, and were forced to retire and yield up the body to the enemy. But when the other troops approached, the Persian horse could no longer hold their ground, but fled, without carrying off the body, having incurred in the attempt a further loss of several of their number. They therefore retired about 2 furlongs, and consulted with each other what was best to be done. Being without a leader, it seemed to them the fittest course to return to Mardonius. When the horse reached the camp, Mardonius and all the Persian army made great lamentation for Mecistius. They shaved off all the hair from their own heads, and cut the manes from their war horses and their sumpter beasts, while they vented their grief in such loud cries that all Boeotia resounded with the clamour, because they had lost the man who, next to Mardonius, was held in the greatest esteem, both by the king and by the Persians generally. So the barbarians, after their own fashion, paid honours to the dead Mecistius. The Greeks, on the other hand, were greatly emboldened by what had happened, seeing that they had not only stood their ground against the attacks of the horse, but had even compelled them to beat a retreat. They therefore placed the dead body of Mecistius upon a cart, and paraded it along the ranks of the army. Now the body was a sight which well deserved to be gazed upon, being remarkable both for stature and for beauty, and it was to stop the soldiers from leaving their ranks to look at it that they resolved to carry it round. After this, the Greeks determined to quit the high ground and go nearer Plataea, as the land there seemed far more suitable for an encampment than the country about Erythrae, particularly because it was better supplied with water. To this place, therefore, and more especially to a spring head which was called Gargaphia, they considered that it would be best for them to remove, after which they might once more encamp in their order. So they took their arms and proceeded along the slopes of Kithaeron, past Hysiae, to the territory of the Plataeans. And here they drew themselves up, nation by nation, close by the fountain Gargaphia, and the sacred precinct of the hero Androcrates, partly along some hillocks of no great height, and partly upon the level of the plain. Here, in the marshalling of the nations, a fierce battle of words arose between the Athenians and the Tegeans, both of whom claimed to have one of the wings assigned to them. On each side were brought forward the deeds which they had done, whether in earlier or in later times, and first the Tegeans urged their claim as follows. This post has been always considered our right, and not the right of any of the other allies, in all the expeditions which have been entered into conjointly by the Peloponnesians, both anciently and in later times. Ever since the Heraclidae made their attempt, after the death of Eurystheus, to return by force of arms into the Peloponnese, this custom has been observed. It was then that the right became ours, and this was the way in which we gained it. When in company with the Achaeans and Ionians, who then dwelt in the Peloponnese, we marched out to the isthmus and pitched our tent over against the invaders, then, as the tale goes, that Hyllus made proclamation, saying, "It needs not to imperil two armies in a general battle, rather let one be chosen from the Peloponnesian ranks, whomsoever they deem the bravest, and let him engage with me in single combat on such terms as shall be agreed upon." The saying pleased the Peloponnesians, and oaths were sworn to the effect following: "If Hyllus conquer the Peloponnesian champion, the Heraclidae shall return to their inheritance. If, on the other hand, he be conquered, the Heraclidae shall withdraw, lead back their army, and engage for the next 100 years to make no further endeavours to force their return. Hereupon Achimus, the son of Aeropus, and grandson of Phageus, who was our leader and king, offered himself, and was preferred before all his brothers in arms as champion, engaged in single combat with Hyllus, and slew him upon the spot. For this exploit we were rewarded by the Peloponnesians of that day with many goodly privileges, which we have ever since enjoyed, and among the rest we obtained the right of holding the leading post in one wing, whenever a joint expedition goes forth beyond our borders. With you then, O Lacedaemonians, we do not claim to compete. Choose you which wing ye please. We yield and grant you the preference, but we maintain that the command of the other wing belongs of right to us, now no less than formerly. Moreover, set aside this exploit which we have related, and still our title to the chief post is better than that of the Athenians. Witness the many glorious fights in which we have been engaged against yourselves, O Spartans, as well as those which we have maintained with others. We have therefore more right to this place than they, for they have performed no exploits to be compared to ours, whether we look to earlier or to later times." Thus spake the Tegeans, and the Athenians made reply as follows: "We're not ignorant that our forces were gathered here not for the purpose of speech-making, but for battle against the barbarian. Yet as the Tegeans have been pleased to bring into debate the exploits performed by our two nations, alike in earlier and in later times, we have no choice but to set before you the grounds on which we claim it as our heritage, deserved by our unchanging bravery, to be preferred above Arcadians. In the first place, then, those very Heraclidae, whose leader they boast to have slain at the Isthmus, and whom the other Greeks wouldn't deceive when they asked for a refuge from the bondage wherewith they were threatened by the people of Mycenae, were given a shelter by us, and we brought down the insolence of Eurystheus, and helped to gain the victory over those who were at that time lords of the Peloponnese. Again, when the Argives led their troops with Polynices against Thebes, and were slain, and refused burial, it's our boast that we went out against the Cadmeans, recovered the bodies, and buried them at Eleusis in our own territory. Another noble deed of ours was that against the Amazons, when they came from their seats upon the Thermodon, and poured their hosts into Attica. And in the Trojan War, too, we were not a whit behind any of the Greeks. But what boots it to speak of these ancient matters? A nation which was brave in those days might have grown cowardly since, and a nation of cowards then might now be valiant. Enough, therefore, of our ancient achievements, had we performed no other exploit than that at Marathon, though in truth we have performed exploits as many and as noble as any of the Greeks. Yet had we performed no other, we should deserve this privilege, and many a one beside. There we stood alone, and singly fought with the Persians. Nay, and venturing on so dangerous a cast, we overcame the enemy, and conquered on that day 46 nations. Does not this one achievement suffice to make good our title to the post we claim? Nevertheless, Lacedaemonians, as to strive concerning place at such a time as this is not right, we are ready to do as ye command, and to take our station at whatever part of the line, and face whatever nation ye think most expedient. Wherever so ye place us, 'twill be our endeavour to behave as brave men. Only declare your will, and we shall at once obey you." Such was the reply of the Athenians, and forthwith all the Lacedaemonian troops cried out with one voice that the Athenians were worthier to have the left wing than the Arcadians. In this way were the Tegeans overcome, and the post was assigned to the Athenians. When this matter had been arranged, the Greek army, which was in part composed of those who came at the first, in part of such as had flocked in from day to day, drew up in the following order. 10,000 Lacedaemonian troops held the right wing, 5,000 of whom were Spartans, and of these 5,000 were attended by a body of 35,000 helots, who were lightly armed, 7 helots to each Spartan. The place next to themselves the Spartans gave to the Tegeans, on account of their courage and of the esteem in which they held them. They were all fully armed and numbered 1,500 men. Next in order came the Corinthians, 5,000 strong, and with them Pausanias had placed at their request the band of 300 which had come from Potidaea in Pellene. The Arcadians of Orchomenus, in number 600, came next, then the Sicyonians, 3,000, then the Epidaurians, 800, then the Troezenians, 1,000, then the Lepreates, 200, the Mycenaeans and Tyrinthians, 400, the Phliasians, 1,000, the Hermioneans, 300, the Eretrians and Styrians, 600, the Chalcidians, 400, and the Ambraciates, 500. After these came the Leucadians and Anactorians, who numbered 800, the Palians of Cephallenia, 200, the Aeginetans, 500, the Megarians, 3,000, and the Plataeans, 600. Last of all, but first in their extremity of the line, were the Athenians, who, to the number of 8,000, occupied the left wing, under the command of Aristides, the son of Lysimachus. All these, except the Helots, 7 of whom, as I said, attended each Spartan, were heavy armed troops, and they amounted to 38,700 men. This was the number of hoplites, or heavy armed soldiers, which was brought together against the barbarian. The light-armed troops consisted of the 35,000 ranged with the Spartans, 7 in attendance upon each, who were all well equipped for the war, and of 34,500 others belonging to the Lacedaemonians and the rest of the Greeks, at the rate nearly of 1 light to 1 heavy-armed. Thus the entire number of the light-armed was 69,500. The Greek army, therefore, which mustered at Plataea, counting light-armed as well as heavy-armed, was but 1,800 men short of 110,000. And this amount was exactly made up by the Thespians who were present in the camp, for 1,800 Thespians, being the whole number left, were likewise with the army. But these men were without arms. Such was the array of the Greek troops when they took post on the Ossopus. The barbarians under Mardonius, when the mourning for Mecistius was at an end, and they learnt that the Greeks were in the Plataean territory, moved likewise towards the river Ossopus, which flows in those parts. On their arrival, Mardonius marshalled them against the Greeks in the following order. Against the Lacedaemonians he posted his Persians, and as the Persians were far more numerous, he drew them up with their ranks deeper than common, and also extended their front, so that part faced the Tegeans. And here he took care to choose out the best troops to face the Lacedaemonians, whilst against the Tegeans he arrayed those on whom he couldn't so much depend. This was done at the suggestion and by the advice of the Thebans. Next to the Persians he placed the Medes, facing the Corinthians, Potidaeans, Orchomeneans, and Sicyonians. Then the Bactrians, facing the Epidaurians, Troezenians, Lepreates, Tyrinthians, Mycenaeans, and Phliasians. After them the Indians, facing the Hermioneans, Eretrians, Styrians, and Chalcidians. Then the Sacans, facing the Ambraciates, Anactorians, Leucadians, Palians, and Aeginetans. Last of all, facing the Athenians, the Plataeans and the Megarians, he placed the troops of the Boeotians, Locrians, Malians and Thessalians, and also the 1,000 Phocians. The whole nation of the Phocians had not joined the Medes. On the contrary, there were some who had gathered themselves into bands about Parnassus, and made expeditions from thence, whereby they distressed Mardonius and the Greeks who sided with him, and so did good service to the Grecian cause. Besides those mentioned above, Mardonius likewise arrayed against the Athenians the Macedonians, and the tribes dwelling about Thessaly. I have named here the greatest of the nations which were marshalled by Mardonius on this occasion, to wit all those of most renown and account. Mixed with these, however, were men of divers other peoples, as Phrygians, Thracians, Mysians, Ionians, and the like, Ethiopians again, and Egyptians, both of the Hermotybian and Calazirian races, whose weapon is the sword, and who are the only fighting men in that country. These persons had formerly served on board the fleet of Xerxes, but Mardonius disembarked them before he left Phalerum. In the land force which Xerxes brought to Athens there were no Egyptians. The number of the barbarians, as I've already mentioned, was 300,000. That of the Greeks, who had made alliance with Mardonius, is known to none, for they were never counted. I should guess that they mustered near 50,000 strong. The troops thus marshalled were all foot soldiers. As for the horse, it was drawn up by itself. When the marshalling of Mardonius's troops by nations and by maniples was ended, the two armies proceeded on the next day to offer sacrifice. The Grecian sacrifice was offered by Tisamenus, the son of Antiochus, who accompanied the army as soothsayer. He was an Elean, and belonged to the Clytiad branch of the Iambidae, but had been admitted among their own citizens by the Lacedaemonians. Now his admission among them was on this wise. Tisamenus had gone to Delphi to consult the god concerning his lack of offspring, when it was declared to him by the Pythoness that he would win 5 very glorious combats. Misunderstanding the oracle and imagining that he was to win combats in the games, Tisamenus at once applied himself to the practice of gymnastics. He trained himself for the pentathlon, and on contending at Olympia came within a little of winning it, for he was successful in everything except the wrestling match, which was carried off by Hieronymus the Andrian. Hereon the Lacedaemonians perceived that the combats of which the oracle spoke were not combats in the games, but battles. They therefore sought to induce Tisamenus to hire out his services to them, in order that they might join him with their Heracleid kings in the conduct of their wars. He, however, when he saw that they set great store by his friendship, forthwith raised his price, and told them, if they would receive him among their citizens, and give him equal rights with the rest, he was willing to do as they desired, but on no other terms would they ever gain his consent. The Spartans, when they heard this, at first thought it monstrous, and ceased to implore his aid. Afterwards, however, when the fearful danger of the Persian war hung over their heads, they sent for him and agreed to his terms. But Tisamenus now, perceiving them so changed, declared he could no longer be content with what he had asked before. They must likewise make his brother Helius a Spartan, with the same rights as himself. In acting thus, he did but follow the example once set by Melampus, at least if kingship may be compared with citizenship. For when the women of Argos were seized with madness, and the Argives would have hired Melampus to come from Pylos and heal them of their disease, he demanded as his reward 1/2 of the kingdom. But as the Argives disdained to stoop to this, they left him and went their way. Afterwards, however, when many more of their women were seized, they brought themselves to agree to his terms, and accordingly they went again to him, and said they were content to give what he required. Hereon Melampus, seeing them so changed, raised his demand, and told them, except they would give his brother Bias 1/3 of the kingdom likewise, he would not do as they wished. So, as the Argives were in a strait, they consented even to this. In like manner, the Spartans, as they were in great need of Tisamenus, yielded everything, and Tisamenus the Elean, having in this way become a Spartan citizen, afterwards in the capacity of soothsayer, helped the Spartans to gain 5 very glorious combats. He and his brother were the only men whom the Spartans ever admitted to citizenship. The 5 combats were these following. The first was the combat at Plataea, the second that near Tegea against the Tegeans and the Argives, the third that at Dipais against all the Arcadians excepting those at Mantinea, the fourth that at the Isthmus against the Messenians, and the fifth that at Tanagra against the Athenians and the Argives. The battle here fought was the last of all the 5. The Spartans had now brought Tisamenus with them to the Plataean territory, where he acted as soothsayer for the Greeks. He found the victims favourable, if the Greeks stood on the defensive, but not if they began the battle or crossed the river Asopus. With Mardonius also, who was very eager to begin the battle, the victims were not favourable for so doing, but he likewise found they bode him well if he was content to stand on his defence. He too had made use of the Grecian rites, for Hegesistratus, an Elean and the most renowned of the Teliads, was his soothsayer. This man had once been taken captive by the Spartans, who, considering that he had done them many grievous injuries, laid him in bonds with the intent to put him to death. Thereupon Hegesistratus, finding himself in so sore a case, since not only was his life in danger, but he knew that he would have to suffer torments of many kinds before his death, Hegesistratus, I say, did a deed for which no words suffice. He had been set with 1 foot in the stocks, which were of wood, but bound with iron bands, and in this condition received from without an iron implement, wherewith he contrived to accomplish the most courageous deed upon record. Calculating how much of his foot he would be able to draw through the hole, he cut off the front portion with his own hand, and then, as he was guarded by watchmen, forced a way through the wall of his prison, and made his escape to Tegea, travelling during the night, but in the daytime stealing into the woods and staying there. In this way, though the Lacedaemonians went out in full force to search for him, he nevertheless escaped, and arrived the 3rd evening at Tegea. So the Spartans were amazed at the man's endurance when they saw on the ground the piece which he had cut off his foot, and yet for all their seeking couldn't find him anywhere. Hegesistratus, having thus escaped the Lacedaemonians, took refuge in Tegea, for the Tegeans at that time were ill friends with the Lacedaemonians. When his wound was healed, he procured himself a wooden foot, and became an open enemy to Sparta. At the last, however, this enmity brought him to trouble, for the Spartans took him captive as he was exercising his office in Zacynthus, and forthwith put him to death. But these things happened some while after the fight at Plataea. At present he was serving Mardonius on the Asopus, having been hired at no inconsiderable price, and here he offered sacrifice with a right good will, in part from his hatred of the Lacedaemonians, in part for lucre's sake. So when the victims didn't allow either the Persians or their Greek allies to begin the battle, these Greeks had their own soothsayer in the person of Hippomachus, a Leucadian. And when soldiers continued to pour into the opposite camp, and the numbers on the Greek side to increase continually, Timagenes, the son of Herpes, a Theban, advised Mardonius to keep a watch on the passes of Kithaeron, telling him how supplies of men kept flocking in day after day, and assuring him that he might cut off large numbers. It was 8 days after the 2 armies first encamped opposite to one another when this advice was given by Timagenes. Mardonius, seeing it to be good, as soon as evening came, sent his cavalry to that pass of Mount Kithaeron, which opens out upon Plataea, a pass called by the Boeotians the 3 Heads, but called the Oak Heads by the Athenians. The horse sent on this errand didn't make the movement in vain. They came upon a body of 500 sumpter beasts, which were just entering the plain, bringing provisions to the Greek camp from the Peloponnese, with a number of men driving them. Seeing this prey in their power, the Persians set upon them and slaughtered them, sparing none, neither man nor beast, till at last, when they had had enough of slaying, they secured such as were left, and bore them off to the camp to Mardonius. After this they waited again for 2 days more, neither army wishing to begin the fight. The barbarians indeed advanced as far as the Asopus, and endeavoured to tempt the Greeks to cross, but neither side actually passed the stream. Still the cavalry of Mardonius harassed and annoyed the Greeks incessantly, for the Thebans, who were zealous in the cause of the Medes, pressed the war forward with all eagerness, and often led the charge till the lines met, when the Medes and Persians took their place, and displayed, many of them, uncommon valour. For 10 days nothing was done more than this, but on the 11th day, from the time when the two hosts first took station, one over against the other, near Plataea, the number of the Greeks being now much greater than it was at the first, and Mardonius being impatient of the delay, there was a conference held between Mardonius, son of Cobrias, and Artabazus, son of Pharnaces, a man who was esteemed by Xerxes more than almost any of the Persians. At this consultation the following were the opinions delivered. Artabazus thought it would be best for them to break up from their quarters as soon as possible, and withdraw the whole army to the fortified town of Thebes, where they had abundant stores of corn for themselves, and of fodder for the sumpter beasts. There, he said, they had only to sit quiet, and the war might be brought to an end on this wise. Coined gold was plentiful in the camp, and uncoined gold too. They had silver, moreover, in great abundance, and drinking cups. Let them not spare to take of these, and distribute them among the Greeks, especially among the leaders in the several cities. 'Twould not be long before the Greeks gave up their liberty without risking another battle for it. Thus the opinion of Artabazus agreed with that of the Thebans, for he too had more foresight than some. Mardonius, on the other hand, expressed himself with more fierceness and obstinacy, and was utterly disinclined to yield. Their army, he said, was vastly superior to that of the Greeks, and they had best engage at once, and not wait till greater numbers were gathered against them. As for Hegesistratus and his victims, they should let them pass unheeded, not seeking to force them to be favourable, but according to the old Persian custom, hasting to join battle. When Mardonius had thus declared his sentiments, no one ventured to say him nay, and accordingly his opinion prevailed, for it was to him and not to Artabazus that the king had given the command of the army. Mardonius now sent for the captains of the squadrons and the leaders of the Greeks in his service, and questioned them, did they know of any prophecy which said that the Persians were to be destroyed in Greece? All were silent, some because they did not know the prophecies, but others who knew them full well, because they didn't think it safe to speak out. So Mardonius, when none answered, said, Since ye know of no such oracle, and do not dare to speak of it, I, who know it well, will myself declare it to you. There is an oracle which says that the Persians shall come into Greece, sack the temple at Delphi, and when they have so done, perish, one and all. Now we, as we are aware of the prediction, will neither go against the temple, nor make any attempt to sack it. We therefore shall not perish for this trespass. Rejoice then thus far, all ye who are well-wishers to the Persians, and doubt not we shall get the better of the Greeks. When he had so spoken, he further ordered them to prepare themselves, and to put all in readiness for a battle upon the morrow. As for the oracle of which Mardonius spoke, and which he referred to the Persians, it did not, I am well assured, mean them, but the Illyrians and the Echalian host. There are, however, some verses of Bacchus which did speak of this battle. By Thermodon's stream and the grass-clad banks of Asopus, see where gather the Grecians, and hark to the foreigners' war-shout. There in death shall lie ere fate or Lachesis doomed him, many a bow-bearing mead, when the day of calamity cometh. These verses, and some others like them, which Musaeus wrote, referred, I well know, to the Persians. The river Thermodon flows between Tanagra and Glissas. After Mardonius had put his question about the prophecies and spoken the above words of encouragement, night drew on apace, and on both sides the watches were set. As soon then as there was silence throughout the camp, the night being now well advanced, and the men seeming to be in their deepest sleep, Alexander, the son of Amyntas, king and leader of the Macedonians, rode up on horseback to the Athenian outposts, and desired to speak with the generals. Hereupon, while the greater part continued on guard, some of the watch ran to the chiefs, and told them there had come a horseman from the Median camp, who wouldn't say a word, except that he wished to speak with the generals, of whom he mentioned the names. They, at once hearing this, made haste to the outpost, where they found Alexander, who addressed them as follows. Men of Athens, that which I'm about to say I trust to your honour, and I charge you to keep it secret from all, excepting Pausanias, if you wouldn't bring me to destruction. Had I not greatly at heart the common welfare of Greece, I should not have come to tell you, but I am myself a Greek by descent, and I wouldn't willingly see Greece exchange freedom for slavery. Know then that Mardonius and his army cannot obtain favourable omens. Had it not been for this, they would have fought with you long ago. Now, however, they have determined to let the victims pass unheeded, and as soon as day dawns to engage in battle. Mardonius, I imagine, is afraid that if he delays you will increase in number. Make ready then to receive him. Should he, however, still defer the combat, do you abide where you are, for his provisions will not hold out many more days. If ye prosper in this war, forget not to do something for my freedom. Consider the risk I have run, out of zeal for the Greek cause, to acquaint you with what Mardonius intends, and to save you from being surprised by the barbarians. I am Alexander of Macedon. As soon as he had said this, Alexander rode back to the camp and returned to the station assigned him. Meanwhile, the Athenian generals hastened to the right wing and told Pausanias all that they had learned from Alexander. Hereupon Pausanias, who no sooner heard the intention of the Persians than he was struck with fear, addressed the generals and said, Since the battle is to come with tomorrow's dawn, it were well that you Athenians should stand opposed to the Persians, and we Spartans to the Boeotians and the other Greeks. For ye know the Medes and their manner of fight, since ye have already fought with them once at Marathon, but we are quite ignorant, and without any experience of their warfare. While, however, there isn't a Spartan here present who has ever fought against a Mede, of the Persians and Thessalians we have had experience. Take then your arms, and march over to our post upon the right, while we supply your place in the left wing. Hereto the Athenians replied, We too long ago, when we saw that the Persians were drawn up to face you, were minded to suggest to you the very course which you have now been first to bring forward. We feared, however, that perhaps our words might not be pleasing to you, but as you have now spoken of these things yourselves, we gladly give our consent, and are ready to do as ye have said. Both sides agreeing hereto, at the dawn of day, the Spartans and Athenians changed places. But the movement was perceived by the Boeotians, and they gave notice of it to Mardonius, who at once, on hearing what had been done, made a change in the disposition of his own forces, and brought the Persians to face the Lacedaemonians. Then Pausanias, finding that his design was discovered, led back his Spartans to the right wing, and Mardonius, seeing this, replaced his Persians on the left of his army. When the troops again occupied their former posts, Mardonius sent a herald to the Spartans, who spoke as follows, Lacedaemonians, in these parts the men say that you are the bravest of mankind, and admire you because you never turn your backs in flight nor quit your ranks, but always stand firm, and either die at your posts or else destroy your adversaries. But in all this which they say concerning you, there is not one word of truth. For now have we seen you, before battle was joined, or our two hosts had come to blows, flying and leaving your posts, wishing the Athenians to make the first trial of our arms, and taking your own station against our slaves. Surely these are not the deeds of brave men. Much do we find ourselves deceived in you, for we believed the reports of you that reached our ears, and expecting that you would send a herald with a challenge to us, proposing to fight by yourselves against our division of native Persians. We, for our part, were ready to have agreed to this. But ye have made us no such offer. Nay, ye seem rather to shrink from meeting us. However, as no challenge of this kind comes from you to us, lo, we send a challenge to you. Why should not you, on the part of the Greeks, as you are thought to be the bravest of all, and we, on the part of the barbarians, fight a battle with equal numbers on both sides? Then, if it seems good to the others to fight likewise, let them engage afterwards. But if not, if they're content that we should fight on behalf of all, let us so do, and whichever side wins the battle, let them win it for their whole army. When the herald had thus spoken, he waited a while, but as no one made him any answer, he went back and told Mardonius what had happened. Mardonius was full of joy thereat, and so puffed up by the empty victory that he at once gave orders to his horse to charge the Greek line. Then the horsemen drew near, and with their javelins and their arrows, for though horsemen they used the bow, sorely distressed the Greek troops, which couldn't bring them to close combat. The fountain of Gargaphia, whence the whole Greek army drew its water, they at this time choked up and spoiled. The Lacedaemonians were the only troops who had their station near the fountain. The other Greeks were more or less distant from it, according to their place in the line. They, however, were not far from the Esopus. Still, as the Persian horse with their missile weapons didn't allow them to approach, and so they couldn't get their water from the river, these Greeks, no less than the Lacedaemonians, resorted at this time to the fountain. When the fountain was choked, the Grecian captains, seeing that the army had no longer a watering place, and observing, moreover, that the cavalry greatly harassed them, held a meeting on these and other matters at the headquarters of Pausanias upon the right. For besides the above-named difficulties, which were great enough, other circumstances added to their distress. All the provisions that they had brought with them were gone, and the attendants who had been sent to fetch supplies from the Peloponnese were prevented from returning to camp by the Persian horse, which had now closed the passage. The captains therefore held a council, whereat it was agreed that if the Persians didn't give battle that day, the Greeks should move to the island, a tract of ground which lies in front of Plataea, at the distance of 10 furlongs from the Esopus and Fount Gargaphia, where the army was encamped at that time. This tract was a sort of island in the continent, for there is a river which, dividing near its source, runs down from Mount Kithaeron into the plain below in 2 streams, flowing in channels about 3 furlongs apart, which after a while unite and become one. The name of this river is Oroe, and the dwellers in those parts call it the daughter of the Esopus. This was the place in which the Greeks resolved to remove, and they chose it first because they would there have no lack of water, and secondly because the horse could not harass them as when it was drawn up right in their front. They thought it best to begin their march at the second watch of the night, lest the Persians should see them as they left their station, and should follow and harass them with their cavalry. It was agreed likewise that after they had reached the place which the Esopus born Oroe surrounds, as it flows down from Kithaeron, they should dispatch the very same night 1/2 of their army towards that mountain range to relieve those whom they had sent to procure provisions, and who were now blocked up in that region. Having made these resolves, they continued during that whole day to suffer beyond measure from the attacks of the enemy's horse. At length, when towards dusk the attacks of the horse ceased, and night having closed in, the hour arrived at which the army was to commence its retreat. the greater number struck their tents and began the march towards the rear. They were not minded, however, to make for the place agreed upon, but in their anxiety to escape from the Persian horse, no sooner had they begun to move than they fled straight to Plataea, where they took post at the temple of Hera, which lies outside the city at the distance of about 20 furlongs from Gargaphia, and here they pitched their tent in front of the sacred building. As soon as Pausanias saw a portion of the troops in motion, he issued orders to the Lacedaemonians to strike their tents and follow those who had been the first to depart, supposing that they were on their march to the place agreed upon. All the captains but one were ready to obey his orders. Amompharetus, however, the son of Polyidas, who was leader of the Pitonate cohort, refused to move, saying he, for one, wouldn't fly from the strangers, or of his own will bring disgrace upon Sparta. It had happened that he was absent from the former conference of the captains, and so what was now taking place astonished him. Pausanias and Euryanax thought it a monstrous thing that Amompharetus wouldn't hearken to them, but considered that it would be yet more monstrous if, when he was so minded, they were to leave the Pitonates to their fate, seeing that if they forsook them to keep their agreement with the other Greeks, Amompharetus and those with him might perish. On this account, therefore, they kept the Lacedaemonian force in its place, and made every endeavour to persuade Amompharetus that he was wrong to act as he was doing. While the Spartans were engaged in these efforts to turn Amompharetus, the only man unwilling to retreat either in their own army or in that of the Tegeans, the Athenians on their side did as follows. Knowing that it was the Spartan temper to say one thing and do another, they remained quiet in their station until the army began to retreat, when they dispatched a horseman to see whether the Spartans really meant to set forth, or whether, after all, they had no intention of moving. The horseman was also to ask Pausanias what he wished the Athenians to do. The herald, on his arrival, found the Lacedaemonians drawn up in their old position and their leaders quarrelling with one another. Pausanias and Euryanax had gone on urging Amompharetus not to endanger the lives of his men by staying behind while the others drew off, but without succeeding in persuading him, until at last the dispute had waxed hot between them just at the moment when the Athenian herald arrived. At this point Amompharetus, who was still disputing, took up with both his hands a vast rock, and placed it at the feet of Pausanias, saying, "With this pebble I give my vote not to run away from the strangers." By strangers he meant barbarians. Pausanias, in reply, called him a fool and a madman, and turning to the Athenian herald, who had made the inquiries with which he was charged, bade him tell his countrymen how he was occupied, and ask them to approach nearer and retreat, or not, according to the movements of the Spartans. So the herald went back to the Athenians, and the Spartans continued to dispute till morning began to dawn upon them. Then Pausanias, who as yet had not moved, gave the signal for retreat, expecting, and rightly as the event proved, that Amompharetus, when he saw the rest of the Lacedaemonians in motion, would be unwilling to be left behind. No sooner was the signal given than all the army, except the Pitonates, began their march, and retreated along the line of the hills, the Tegeans accompanying them. The Athenians likewise set off in good order, but proceeded by a different way from the Lacedaemonians, for while the latter clung to the hilly ground and the skirts of Mount Kithyron on account of the fear which they entertained of the enemy's horse, the former betook themselves to the low country and marched through the plain. As for Amompharetus, at first he didn't believe that Pausanias would really dare to leave him behind. He therefore remained firm in his resolve to keep his men at their post. When, however, Pausanias and his troops were now some way off, Amompharetus, thinking himself forsaken in good earnest, ordered his band to take their arms and led them at a walk towards the main army. Now the army was waiting for them at a distance of about 10 furlongs, having halted upon the river Malois at a place called Argiopius, where stands a temple dedicated to Eleusinian Demeter. They had stopped here that in case Amampharitus and his band should refuse to quit the spot where they were drawn up, and should really not stir from it, they might have it in their power to move back and lend them assistance. Amampharitus, however, and his companions rejoined the main body, and at the same time the whole mass of the barbarian cavalry arrived, and began to press hard upon them. The horsemen had followed their usual practice and ridden up to the Greek camp, when they discovered that the place where the Greeks had been posted hitherto was deserted. Hereupon they pushed forward without stopping, and as soon as they overtook the enemy, pressed heavily on them. Mardonius, when he heard that the Greeks had retired under cover of the night, and beheld the place where they had been stationed empty, called to him Thorax of Larissa, and his brethren, Eurypylus and Thrasideus, and said, O sons of Eleus, what will ye say now when ye see yonder place empty? Why, you, who dwell in their neighbourhood, told me the Lacedaemonians never fled from battle, but were brave beyond all the rest of mankind. Lately, however, you yourselves beheld them charge their place in the line, and here, as all may see, they have run away during the night. Verily, when their turn came to fight with those who are of a truth the bravest warriors in all the world, they showed plainly enough that they are men of no worth, who have distinguished themselves among Greeks, men likewise of no worth at all. However, I can readily excuse you, who, knowing nothing of the Persians, praised these men from your acquaintance with certain exploits of theirs. But I marvel all the more at Artabazus, that he should have been afraid of the Lacedaemonians, and have therefore given us so dastardly a counsel, bidding us, as he did, break up our camp and remove to Thebes, and there allow ourselves to be besieged by the Greeks, advice whereof I shall take care to inform the king. But of this hereafter. Now we must not allow them to escape us, but must pursue after them till we overtake them, and then we must exact vengeance for all the wrongs which have been suffered at their hands by the Persians. When he had so spoken, he crossed the Asopus, and led the Persians forward at a run directly upon the track of the Greeks, whom he believed to be in actual flight. He couldn't see the Athenians, for as they had taken the way of the plain, they were hidden from his sight by the hills. He therefore led on his troops against the Lacedaemonians and the Tegeans only. When the commanders of the other divisions of the barbarians saw the Persians pursuing the Greeks so hastily, they all forthwith seized their standards and hurried after at their best speed, in great disorder and disarray. On they went, with loud shouts and in a wild rout, thinking to swallow up the runaways. Meanwhile, Pausanias had sent a horseman to the Athenians at the time when the cavalry first fell upon him, with this message: Men of Athens, now that the great struggle has come, which is to decide the freedom or the slavery of Greece, we twain, Lacedaemonians and Athenians, are deserted by all the other allies, who have fled away from us during the past night. Nevertheless, we are resolved what to do. We must endeavour, as best we may, to defend ourselves and to succour one another. Now had the horse fallen upon you first, we ourselves, with the Tegeans, who remained faithful to the Greek cause, would have been bound to render you assistance against them. As, however, the entire body has advanced upon us, 'tis your place to come to our aid, sore pressed as we are by the enemy. Should you yourselves be so straitened that you cannot come, at least send us your archers, and be sure you will earn our gratitude. We acknowledge that throughout this whole war there has been no zeal to be compared to yours. We therefore doubt not that you will do us this service. The Athenians, as soon as they received this message, were anxious to go to the aid of the Spartans and to help them to the uttermost of their power. But as they were upon the march, the Greeks on the king's side, whose place in the line had been opposite theirs, fell upon them, and so harassed them by their attacks that it wasn't possible for them to give the succour they desired. Accordingly, the Lacedaemonians and the Tegeans, whom nothing could induce to quit their side, were left alone to resist the Persians. Including the light-armed, the number of the former was 50,000, while that of the Tegeans was 3,000. Now therefore, as they were about to engage with Mardonius and the troops under him, they made ready to offer sacrifice. The victims, however, for some time were not favourable, and during the delay many fell on the Spartan side, and a still greater number were wounded. For the Persians had made a rampart of their wicker shields, and shot from behind them such clouds of arrows that the Spartans were sorely distressed. The victims continued unpropitious, till at last Pausanias raised his eyes to the Heraium of the Plataeans, and calling the goddess to his aid, besought her not to disappoint the hopes of the Greeks. As he offered his prayer, the Tegeans, advancing before the rest, rushed forward against the enemy, and the Lacedaemonians, who had obtained favourable omens the moment that Pausanias prayed, at length, after their long delay, advanced to the attack, while the Persians, on their side, left shooting and prepared to meet them. And first the combat was at the wicker shields. Afterwards, when these were swept down, a fierce contest took place by the side of the temple of Demeter, which lasted long and ended in a hand-to-hand struggle. The barbarians many times seized hold of the Greek spears and brake them, for in boldness and warlike spirit the Persians were not a whit inferior to the Greeks, but they were without bucklers, untrained, and far below the enemy in respect of skill in arms. Sometimes singly, sometimes in bodies of 10, now fewer and now more in number, they dashed forward upon the Spartan ranks, and so perished. The fight went most against the Greeks, where Mardonius, mounted upon a white horse, and surrounded by the bravest of all the Persians, the 1,000 picked men, fought in person. So long as Mardonius was alive, this body resisted all attacks, and while they defended their own lives, struck down no small number of Spartans. But after Mardonius fell, and the troops with him, which were the main strength of the army, perished, the remainder yielded to the Lacedaemonians and took to flight. The light clothing and want of bucklers were of the greatest hurt to them, for they had to contend against men heavily armed, while they themselves were without any such defence. Then was the warning of the oracle fulfilled, and the vengeance which was due to the Spartans for the slaughter of Leonidas was paid them by Mardonius. Then too did Pausanias, the son of Cleombrotus and grandson of Anaxandridas, I omit to recount his other ancestors, since they are the same with those of Leonidas, win a victory exceeding in glory all those to which our knowledge extends. Mardonius was slain by Aemnestus, a man famous in Sparta, the same who in the Messenian War, which came after the struggle against the Medes, fought a battle near Steniclarus, with but 300 men, against the whole force of the Messenians, and himself perished, and the 300 with him. The Persians, as soon as they were put to flight by the Lacedaemonians, ran hastily away without preserving any order, and took refuge in their own camp within the wooden defence which they had raised in the Theban territory. It's a marvel to me how it came to pass that although the battle was fought quite close to the grove of Demeter, yet not a single Persian appears to have died on the sacred soil, nor even to have set foot upon it, while round about the precinct, in the unconsecrated ground, great numbers perished. I imagine, if it's lawful in matters which concern the gods to imagine anything, that the goddess herself kept them out, because they had burnt her dwelling at Eleusis. Such, then, was the issue of this battle. Artabazus, the son of Pharnaces, who had disapproved from the first of the king's leaving Mardonius behind him, and had made great endeavours, but all in vain, to dissuade Mardonius from risking a battle, when he found that the latter was bent on acting otherwise than he wished, did as follows. He had a force under his orders which was far from inconsiderable, amounting as it did to near 40,000 men. Being well aware, therefore, how the battle was likely to go, as soon as the two armies began to fight, he led his soldiers forward in an orderly array, bidding them one and all proceed at the same pace, and follow him with such celerity as they should observe him to use. Having issued these commands, he pretended to lead them to the battle. But when, advancing before his army, he saw that the Persians were already in flight, instead of keeping the same order, he wheeled his troops suddenly round and beat a retreat. Nor did he even seek shelter within the palisade or behind the walls of Thebes, but hurried on into Phocis, wishing to make his way to the Hellespont with all possible speed.